September 17th, 1944. The heat in Arkansas was thick, the kind that clings to your uniform long after you've stopped sweating. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura stepped off the U.S. Army bus with his hands cuffed and head high. He didn't flinch when the Americans stared. He had survived the siege of Saipan. He had watched men die with honor, and men break under fire. But nothing had prepared him for what stood beyond the fence. A child, blonde hair, big eyes, no fear. She was eating an apple and smiling at him. Behind her, a dozen more. Some waved, one even held up a sandwich, as if offering it to a friend. Nakamura froze. His instincts screamed, trap. Where were the angry faces, the spit, the slurs? In Japan, they were told that Americans hated them, that they'd be beaten, paraded, starved. He braced for humiliation. But all he were children, curious, calm, unafraid. The guard beside him muttered, "Damn kids, don't know any better." And Nakamura kept his gaze locked. The girl bitten into her apple and gave a small, cheerful nod. He looked away. Something twisted in his chest. He didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of the end. Before the war, Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura had never even seen a foreigner. He studied engineering at the Imperial Naval Academy, raised on rice, radio, and reverence for the Emperor. His instructors taught him that the West was decaying, a civilization of soft men and soft machines. He believed it with all his heart. In early 1942, he stood on the deck of the Koshu Maru, watching Japanese flags rise across the Pacific. The empire was expanding fast. Every island felt like proof of destiny. He remembered the propaganda reels in Tokyo, fat American businessmen stumbling over jazz music, films of Harlem slums, degenerate art. They called it Bunmei no Hakai, the decay of civilization. When he volunteered for Saipan, he expected hardship. He expected to kill or be killed. But surrender? That had never been part of the plan. Then came June 1944. The bombardment was endless. He watched civilians throw themselves from cliffs, choosing death over capture. And when his own bunker collapsed, Nakamura crawled out of the ash with a broken arm and raised his hands. He expected pain. He expected spitting. Instead, an American medic offered him morphine, then water, then a chocolate bar. They loaded him on a stretcher with care. One soldier even saluted him. Nakamura lay in silence, blinking under the blinding light of a transport ship. A young American nurse adjusted his blanket. She couldn't have been older than his sister. She looked him in the eyes and didn't flinch. That was the first moment he felt unsteady, not from injury, but from confusion. 2 weeks later, he arrived in Hawaii. The camp had beds, showers, clean clothes. They played passball in the afternoons. A radio played swing music. He heard someone say, "Benny Goodman." The guards weren't cruel. In fact, they seemed bored. When he asked for paper, they gave him a notebook. When he fell sick, they brought him soup. One morning, he saw something in the corner of the mess hall. A red vending machine. Cold drinks, Coca-Cola. He had read about it. The taste of capitalism. He took a sip. It burned his throat. And yet, it was refreshing. Other prisoners whispered that this was a trap, a slow, invisible way to break their spirit. But Nakamura wasn't sure anymore. They were allowed to write letters. He sent one to his mother. I am alive. Treated well. America is not what I was told. By the time he reached Arkansas, in late September, part of him had adapted. The rail cars were clean, the guards polite. The air smelled like corn and dust. But he still expected the people to hate him. He expected angry mobs. Instead, he saw picnic blankets, farmers driving tractors, children on bicycles. Inside the camp, routines were strict but fair. Roll call, meals, work detail, lights out. And every evening, music. Glenn Miller, Ella Fitzgerald. A German POW named Carl from the next barrack joked, "It's not war, it's a jazz retirement." Nakamura didn't laugh, but he wrote it down. And that girl at the fence, the one with the apple, kept returning, each time a little closer. One morning, she left a flower near the gate, a daisy. He didn't touch it, but he stared at it until the sun went down. Whatever this country was, it didn't match the enemy. He was trained to hate. Something was wrong, and for the first time, he started to wonder, not if Japan would win, but if they had ever stood a chance at all. It started with small things, not dramatic, just strange. Lieutenant Nakamura was trimming hedges near the mess hall when he saw a boy, maybe 12, standing just outside the outer fence. No guards stopped him. No one seemed alarmed. The boy tossed a baseball in the air, caught it, tossed it again. Then he looked straight at Nakamura and smiled. Nakamura paused, looked away. But the boy didn't leave. A few minutes later, he said something in English. Slow, careful. Want to play catch? Nakamura didn't respond. Couldn't. He was holding garden shears. The boy, just a ball. No fear, no distance. As if the barbed wire meant nothing. Later that night, Nakamura mentioned it to Sergeant Watanabe, an older NCO who had fought in Shanghai. The sergeant laughed bitterly. They let their children near enemy soldiers? This country has no discipline. But Nakamura wasn't so sure. The next week, it happened again. A group of children brought cookies. One guard shrugged. It's just sugar and flour. Nakamura didn't eat them, but others did. Corporal Ishikawa, a skinny radio operator from Okinawa, said something that stuck with him. They think we're not dangerous. That's worse than hate. Nakamura said nothing. He began noticing more. The guards left rifles leaning on walls. One let a prisoner borrow a cigarette lighter. A German POW painted murals in the dining hall, landscapes of Colorado and Utah. Where was the suspicion? The tension? Why did they trust prisoners of war with hammers and paintbrushes? One afternoon, during work duty near the perimeter fence, a school bus passed by. Children pressed their faces to the glass, waving, pointing, laughing. Nakamura turned away. The shame wasn't in captivity anymore. It was in being seen as weak. That night, he couldn't sleep. The barrack creaked in the wind. From a nearby bunk, someone whistled, "Chattanooga choo-choo." Nakamura stared at the ceiling and whispered to himself, "If we were in Manchuria, and the roles were reversed, would our children wave?" He already knew the answer. Something was wrong. Lieutenant Nakamura stood at morning roll call, his uniform pressed, posture perfect. But his mind was somewhere else. It had been 3 weeks since he saw the girl with the apple. Now she came often, usually with a different dress, always with the same look, fearless, warm, curious. He tried not to notice, but her presence echoed louder than the bugle. Inside the camp, change was creeping in like fog. One German prisoner had started carving wooden toys for the local children. The Americans allowed it, encouraged it. Nakamura found this disturbing. "We are soldiers," he muttered, "not entertainers." But others didn't seem to mind. Some even smiled more. Then came the library. The camp commander, a rotund captain from Kansas named White, ordered a reading room be opened for POWs, shelves filled with donated books, English, German, even some Japanese, novels, manuals, American history. "Education," the captain said, "makes good neighbors after war." To Nakamura, it sounded like poison wrapped in sugar. Still, he entered once, just to observe. And there, sitting quietly by a window, was Private Takeda, reading The Grapes of Wrath with tears in his eyes. "You wouldn't understand," Takeda said. "They suffer too." Nakamura scolded him. Empathy is not a soldier's duty. But the words felt brittle. A week later, Nakamura was assigned to kitchen duty. He expected rough work, peeling potatoes, scrubbing pans. Instead, the American cook, a short man with kind eyes, handed him an apron and said, "We're making meatloaf." They cooked side by side. He told Nakamura his son was fighting in Europe. Then he paused, looked him straight in the eyes. "I don't hate you," he said. "War's the enemy, not men." Nakamura nodded stiffly, but something shifted. That night, he sat on his bunk and opened his journal. Instead of sketches of troop formations, he drew the meatloaf. Later, Sergeant Watanabe approached him. "I saw you smiling today." It was a reflex. "No," Watanabe said. "It was surrender." Nakamura closed the journal. What is there left to defend? Outside, in the dark, the guards chatted freely. Their rifles slung low. Their boots untied. The war was far away now. And Nakamura couldn't tell if that was mercy or defeat. It was a Sunday. The kind of American autumn morning where the sky looks like polished glass and the air carries the scent of wood smoke and leaves. Lieutenant Nakamura was sweeping near the chapel tent, a structure built by the Germans, painted white with a crooked wooden cross. Then he heard music, not from a radio, but real, human voices, children's voices. He looked up. A small crowd had gathered near the west fence. American school children, maybe 24, were setting up folding chairs. A woman unfolded sheet music, a teacher perhaps. The children began to sing, soft, clear. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." Nakamura stood motionless. The broom in his hand tilted slowly, then slipped from his grip. They were singing to the prisoners. Other POWs emerged from the barracks, drawn by the sound. Some laughed. Some stood solemn. One German clapped softly in rhythm, but stopped when no one joined. Nakamura's chest tightened. He had surveyed naval bombardments. He had seen men burn, watched friends die with honor. But this pierced him deeper than any blade. The song ended. The children bowed. A boy, maybe 10, stepped forward and shouted, "We hope you come home safe." No mockery, no irony, just innocence. Something cracked inside Nakamura. He turned, walked back behind the barracks. He sat down on a crate and pressed his hands to his face. And for the first time in years, he wept, not from grief, but from the unbearable weight of being seen as human. He remembered Tokyo, the war parades, the banners, the pride. His younger brother at age 12, marching in school uniform, shouting imperial slogans. If an American prisoner had walked through Tokyo, would his brother have sung? Never. Nakamura leaned back and stared at the blue sky. The Americans weren't just fighting with tanks. They were fighting with children, with songs, with kindness. And in that moment, he realized something terrifying. It wasn't their firepower that made them unstoppable. It was their lack of fear. A new prisoner arrived the next morning. Lieutenant Sato, lean, sun-scorched, eyes like stone. He had been captured in Guam after evading for 12 days in the jungle. He brought stories, not rumors, facts. And he carried a folded piece of paper wrapped in a sock. That evening, after roll call, a group of officers gathered in the shadows behind Barracks 6. Nakamura among them. Sato unfolded the paper. A hand-drawn map, crude but clear. "It's a logistics base," he whispered. "Near Houston, hundreds of acres, everything standardized. Forklifts, trains, refrigerated warehouses." The others leaned in. "I saw a convoy of trucks, 10 miles long, full of fuel, spare parts, uniforms, candy." Someone laughed. "Candy?" "I watched a soldier drink Coca-Cola while changing a tire," Sato said. "He didn't even put the bottle down." Silence. Sato's voice lowered. "They have more rubber tires in one depot than our entire army in Burma." A few scoffed. One muttered, "Propaganda." But Nakamura didn't. He had seen it in miniature. Boxes arriving at camp, perfectly labeled, always on time. Ketchup packets, pencils, books, soap. Not luxuries, systems. Sato continued. "They built pipelines under the ocean. Their engineers can land on beaches and have fuel flowing in 2 days." Someone asked, "Why share this?" Sato's jaw clenched. "Because we were never fighting soldiers. We were fighting factories." That night, Nakamura couldn't sleep. He walked to the fence, stared through the wire at the empty fields, and remembered the singing children. He imagined the trucks Sato described. What's the maps? The thought made his chest hollow. In his journal, he wrote, "If they can build supply lines longer than our borders, if they can ship toys and oranges across oceans during war, what chance did we ever have?" A gust of wind passed. Somewhere in the dark, a radio crackled with Glenn Miller. He closed his eyes and whispered, "We are not the future." Winter came early that year. The Arkansas winds cut through wool uniforms, through skin, through belief. Lieutenant Nakamura sat alone in the corner of the barracks, his journal open. Pages filled not with troop formations or battle plans, but with fragments. English words he no longer translated, names of American towns, lists of supplies, songs, quotes. He stared at a phrase he had underlined 3 times. "They pity us." Across the room, Corporal Ishikawa was drawing a pin-up girl from a magazine, smiling, wearing a baseball cap, holding a wrench. He said she worked in a Detroit tank factory. "We were told women should stay silent," Ishikawa muttered. "And yet, she built a Sherman." Nakamura didn't reply. Instead, he remembered something from Saipan. A boy, no older than that child at the fence, had thrown a grenade into a bunker, then bowed before death. They had cheered his honor. Now, Nakamura wasn't so sure what honor meant. That afternoon, a group of POWs attended a lecture in the chapel tent. A Protestant chaplain had been invited to speak, by request of the Germans. Nakamura didn't care for sermons, but he went. The chaplain didn't preach. Instead, he read a letter from an American mother to her son in Europe. "I packed you warm socks. I hope you're not cold. I pray for you and your enemies. May they have mothers too." The room fell silent. That night, Nakamura stared at the ceiling. He had always believed in sacrifice, that to die for the emperor was the highest form of love. But this quiet mercy, it was something else. It wasn't loud. It didn't wear medals. And yet, it moved him more than any sword ever had. 2 weeks later, he was called to the camp office. An American colonel sat behind a desk, flipping through his file. "You're educated," the colonel said. "You speak some English?" Nakamura nodded. The colonel leaned in. "We're offering classes, civics, engineering, even American history. You don't have to attend, but it's open to you." Nakamura asked, "Why?" The colonel smiled. "Because someday you'll go home. And when you do, we want you to know who we are." Nakamura walked out in silence. Back in his barrack, he wrote, "We thought they were arrogant, but maybe they're just certain." He turned the page, drew a circle, then a daisy. The flower the girl had left by the fence. He had once seen her as a symbol of weakness. Now he saw her as the future. And Japan, his beloved homeland, felt very, very far behind. The trucks arrived before dawn. Not tanks, not jeeps, just trucks, flatbeds with canvas tops, lined up like teeth along the gravel road that led to the camp's rear gate. Lieutenant Nakamura watched from the work detail shed as they rolled in, one after another, engines humming with mechanical certainty. "Resupply day," said the American sergeant, sipping coffee from a tin mug. "Camp gets a full rotation every 2 weeks, rain or shine." Nakamura raised an eyebrow. 2 weeks? For a prison camp in the middle of nowhere. Not a battalion? Not a combat zone, just 100 prisoners in Arkansas, getting deliveries like clockwork. He counted the crates as they came off the trucks. Canned beans, coffee, toilet paper, typewriter ribbons, socks, wrenches, ink, soap, razors. Each box labeled in English. Each line of text printed with military precision. Unit 12B. DSD. POW. OPs. South Region. Issue. Boom. Date. Over 4. Note where handwriting, no guesswork, standardized and streamlined. The German interpreter beside him muttered, "Ford would be proud." Nakamura turned. "Ford?" The German grinned. "Everything here works like an assembly line. Men, logistics, even the war." Later that afternoon, Nakamura was assigned to unload cartons from a separate truck. Inside were ice blocks, thick, crystal-clear slabs wrapped in straw, ice. In wartime Japan, ice was a luxury reserved for officers or dying patients. Here, it was for refrigeration, to keep the POW's milk cold. He stared into the storage shed as cold air rolled over his hands. A guard chuckled. "Yeah, we like things fresh." That evening, Nakamura walked past the kitchen just as dinner trays were being handed out. Mashed potatoes, green beans, a slice of peach pie. Peach pie? In a prisoner camp. Back in the barracks, Sergeant Watanabe shook his head. "They waste more on us than we spend on our infantry." And he was right. The next morning, Nakamura peeked into the camp office where a logistics map had been pinned to the wall. Colored lines stretched across the southern U.S., linking depots, rails, airfields, ports. Not battle plans, but supply lines. He stood there longer than he should have. Because suddenly, he understood. This was the battlefield, not Guadalcanal, not Iwo Jima. This, the trucks, the buzz, the pie, the pencils, the system that moved everything without error. In Japan, they used horses to pull carts. Here, the horses had been replaced with gasoline and schedules. He returned to his bunk and wrote, "Their true weapon is not fire, it's rhythm. Steel and sugar, arriving on time." The class met on Tuesdays and Thursdays, inside a converted storage hut with 2 blackboards, 20 chairs, and a dusty American flag nailed crooked above the door. Lieutenant Nakamura hadn't planned to attend, but something in him, curiosity, maybe resentment, pulled him there anyway. The instructor was a civilian, a balding man with spectacles and a soft Kentucky drawl. He taught civics to enemy soldiers. "This," he said, pointing at the board, "is what makes us dangerous." He didn't mean tanks. He meant ideas. Nakamura sat in the back, arms crossed, but he listened. The lesson wasn't about laws or elections. It was about production. "How do you build a B-17? The teacher asked. "Answer, you don't? 1,000 people do, in 20 cities, on 1 clock. He showed photos, men and women in overalls, assembling parts on conveyor belts. Detroit, Chicago, San Diego. Nakamura blinked. Women. Building bombers? In the Empire, women served tea. Here, they welded steel. The teacher continued. "We don't protect knowledge. We distribute it. We don't fear the weak link. We train it. We don't punish failure. We fix it." A POW from Bavaria raised his hand. "Why teach us?" The man smiled. "Because when you go home, We want you to tell the truth. Nakamura looked around. Every seat was filled. He stepped outside during break and watched 2 American guards tossing a football, laughing like schoolboys. A voice behind him said, "You think they're stupid?" It was the German interpreter. "They're not," the man added. "They're free. Free." That word, free, landed heavy. Nakamura had spent his entire life under command. Every salute, every meal, every belief issued from above. But here, even the children made choices. He remembered the girl with the apple. She had chosen to smile. He once saw it as ignorance. Now, he saw it as power. That night, a new delivery arrived. Books. Among them, a manual stamped U.S. Army Field Repair, Modular Systems. He flipped through it. It detailed how parts were designed for rapid swap-out. No repairs in the field, just replacements. Efficiency over perfection. Nakamura whispered, "They built a war they could afford to lose pieces of." That was it. Japan made sacred weapons. The U.S. made disposable ones, by the millions. Not because they didn't care, because they understood that the system mattered more than the symbol. And maybe people worked the same way. He turned to the final page of his journal and wrote, "In our world, obedience is worship. In theirs, innovation is patriotism." He put down the pen, then reached for an American dictionary. The war ended with a silence. No trumpet, no roar. Just a notice tacked to the camp bulletin board. Japan has surrendered. August 15th, 1945. Lieutenant Nakamura read it twice. The words didn't sting. They numbed. That night, the guards didn't celebrate. They lit a bonfire, brought out records, played Glenn Miller beneath the stars. One American soldier poured coffee into a metal cup, sat across from Nakamura, and said, "War over. You boys are going home." Nakamura nodded. He looked up at the stars and felt very, very small. The next morning, the prisoners received newspapers. On the front page, numbers, columns and rows, ink and certainty. America had produced 96,118 aircraft, 27,000 Sherman tanks, over 3 billion pounds of canned food, 6,000 ships, including 151 aircraft carriers. Enough fuel to supply 4 armies and still ship oranges to POW camps. Nakamura stared at the paper, unable to look away. He remembered Saipan. His unit had started with 70 men. By the end, only 5 walked. Not because they were weaker, but because they were outbuilt. A memo circulated among the prisoners, typed, translated by a German officer. It quoted a U.S. general. "We didn't outfight them. We outproduced them." Later that week, Nakamura was given a tour of the logistics yard behind the camp. He saw stockpiles that had never been used. Tires, wire, boots. Crates labeled winter gear, Arctic use only, in Arkansas. He turned to the American guard. "Why send these here?" The man shrugged. "Just in case? Just in case." That phrase rang louder than any battle cry. At lunch, Nakamura picked up a Stars and Stripes newspaper left on a bench. An editorial read, "Democracy means not having to fear your own commander. Production means not fearing the battlefield. Together, they win wars before they're fought. He folded it gently. That evening, he wrote one final line in his journal. They sent books to prisoners, ice cream to deserts, gasoline to jungles, and their children to sing. He paused, then added, "We raised boys for death. They raised them for freedom, and still won. The trucks came at dawn, just like the first time. Only now they carried men going home, not into war, but into memory." Lieutenant Nakamura stood at the gate, suitcase in hand, uniform faded, spine still straight. The air was crisp. October. The last breath of Arkansas warmth before the cold would claim the land again. He looked up, and there she was, the girl with the apple. Older now, maybe 13. Taller, but unmistakable. She stood by the fence, alone, her hair tied in a red ribbon. She didn't wave, she bowed. Nakamura stepped forward. For a moment, the world stood still, a Japanese officer and an American child, divided by war and a wire fence. He placed his hand on his heart, then bowed, deep, full, formal, the kind of bow reserved for emperors and gratitude. The guards called out names, the line moved. But Nakamura stayed there for one last look. In Tokyo, weeks later, he stood in front of his younger brother. The boy wore a black armband. Their cousin had died in Manchuria. "He died with honor," the boy said proudly. Nakamura said nothing. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out something wrapped in wax paper. A slice of dried apple. He handed it to his brother. The boy frowned. "What is this?" Nakamura smiled. "It's what the enemy gave me, when they no longer saw me as one." Years later, when he was old and gray, Nakamura would tell his grandson, "They didn't win because they fought harder. They won because their children weren't taught to hate." He paused, looked out at the rice fields. "They fought with steel," he whispered, voice like wind, "but conquered with sunshine."